Welcome to today's Explainer. We are going to be unpacking a monumental pivot in modern economic history, specifically the absolute undeniable necessity of India's economic reforms just prior to 1991. We're going to look at the intense crisis that forced a tightly controlled economy to transform into a global powerhouse.
Okay, let's dive into this. Imagine an entire nation, a massive global economy, realizing it is literally exactly 3 weeks away from total catastrophic financial collapse and international default. That was India's terrifying reality in 1991. But how on earth did it get to the very edge of the precipice?
Section 1. The Fragile Foundation.
Now, you know a crisis of this magnitude doesn't just spring up out of nowhere. It was sitting on a deeply fragile foundation. Pre-1991, economic planning was already kind of struggling. We're talking chronically low rates of economic growth, which naturally cascaded into rising unemployment. On top of that, public sector industries, which were supposed to be the main engines of the economy, were performing incredibly poorly. Combine all that with seriously inadequate infrastructural facilities, and well, the whole system was just brittle. It was practically waiting for a spark.
Section 2. The 1991 Forex Crisis.
So what was that spark? It arrived in the form of the perfect storm, a massive foreign exchange shortage. The immediate catalyst was purely geopolitical. In 1991, the Gulf War between Iraq and Kuwait triggered a massive global spike in oil prices. Because India relied super heavily on imported oil, this external shock drastically inflated their import bill. It just drained the foreign currency reserves they desperately needed just to keep the country running.
Now, usually when your import bill skyrockets, what do? You borrow. But India's external debt had already been compounding for years. The sheer burden of interest and repayment on those old debts was completely crushing. So the crucial point is, when they actually sought help, fresh credit lines from the IMF, the World Bank, and commercial lenders were flat out denied. They were completely frozen out.
And things were equally turbulent back at home. Domestic political instability triggered widespread panic, which led to a really rapid capital flight. Specifically, we saw non-resident Indian, or NRI, deposits being withdrawn at an alarming rate. Money was pouring out of the country at the exact moment it was needed the most.
Look at the underlying math here. It's undeniable. Import growth had basically always vastly outstripped export growth. India was consistently buying way more from the world than it was selling. This chronic structural trade imbalance meant it was mathematically impossible to fund essential imports going forward. It was setting up a climax of absolute desperation. Which brings us to that ultimate, terrifying metric we started with. India's remaining foreign exchange reserves were only enough to cover 3 weeks of imports. Just 3 weeks. That is barely 5.7% of the year. Default meant being totally locked out of the global economy, unable to import essential food, fuel, or even medicine.
Section 3. The Soviet Collapse.
And this brilliantly illustrates the final, devastating shock that hit right at the end of 1990, the total loss of an economic safety net. Previously, the USSR and Eastern Europe provided these guaranteed major markets for Indian consumer goods, but their sudden political collapse meant India was instantly forced to completely reorganize its trade policies. Ready or not, they had to go out and compete in the harsh, highly competitive global open market.
Section 4. The Bailout Conditionalities.
So facing astronomical import bills, fleeing capital, and a terrifying 3-week countdown to default, India had absolutely zero leverage left. They needed an international rescue, and that came with strict, unyielding conditionalities from the IMF and World Bank in exchange for fresh credit. First, India was forced to severely cut down its fiscal deficit and slash the rate of money supply growth. Second, they had to totally liberalize the heavily controlled domestic economy. And third, they had to relax their strict restrictions on international trade. Deregulation became the only path to survival. These forced conditionalities completely dismantled the old system, right? But they also paved the way for the massive structural reforms that ultimately transformed the country into the economic powerhouse you see today. Which leaves us with a massive question to ponder. When you are forced to change every rule in the book, how do you actually rebuild an economy of that scale from the ground up? Well, that's exactly what we'll be exploring next time. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.